I would never have imagined that a single remark from a doctor could shatter my life so completely, leaving it irreparable. But when Dr. Karatanov in that hospital firmly grasped my elbow, pulled me aside, and whispered, "Leave this place immediately and file for divorce," I knew instantly. Everything I had believed about our 40 years of a strong marriage had just crumbled beneath my feet. I had arrived with my daughter-in-law, Lyudmila, for her final scheduled prenatal checkup. We were both eagerly anticipating the arrival of our first grandchild, and honestly, I was radiating with joy, like a schoolgirl. I had even prepared a small hand-knitted blanket, envisioning how we would welcome the baby home. There she was, lying on the examination table. The doctor moved the transducer and the screen showed indistinct shapes, numbers, lines. Suddenly, his expression changed. It wasn't just serious. It was as if he had witnessed something he shouldn't have. My heart plummeted into my stomach. He looked at me, his voice trembling, and said, "Sofia Pavlovna, I need to speak with you in private." At first, I didn't understand why he wanted to talk to me. Lyudmila was the one who was pregnant, but he gently helped her to sit up, asked a nurse to stay with her, and led me into the corridor to a place where we wouldn't be overheard. "Did you see the date?" he asked. "What date?" My throat felt parched. He turned the monitor so I could see the lines and numbers again, and in that moment, I felt I couldn't breathe. The due date didn't add up at all. The baby Lyudmila was carrying couldn't possibly be my son Roman's, because Roman had been on a business trip precisely when this child must have been conceived. Not vaguely around that time, but exactly then. I had seen him off myself, counted the days, and eagerly awaited his return. Dr. Karatanov clearly understood that I wasn't in a state for platitudes. He spoke softly but precisely, as if afraid I might collapse. "Sofia Pavlovna, the pregnancy is 8.5 months along. Your son was abroad 9 months ago, and I treated your husband, Fyodor Nikolaevich, precisely 9 months ago. He had injured his back. I remember that date because it was an unpleasant incident. You also called, asking how he was. It all aligns." Something inside me snapped, like a switch being flicked. My husband, my daughter-in-law, a grandchild who wasn't my grandchild, and in that same instant another thought surfaced, starkly clear and chilling. All my real estate, the house, the plots of land, everything I had managed for decades, everything outsiders considered family wealth, it was all now at risk. On paper and in reality, I had about 120 million rubles invested in properties, apartments, land, commercial spaces. I hadn't acquired this effortlessly or through a lottery win. I had worked for it. And now it dawned on me. This wasn't a simple infidelity. It was a plan. They intended for me to accept this child as my rightful grandchild, and then, when the time came, they would have grounds to lay claim to my inheritance, presenting it as a beautiful facade, family, a child, care, but in reality, deception and calculation. However, what Fyodor and Lyudmila didn't know was that I, Sofia Melnikova, had not lived my life as a naive fool, and what I was about to do would shatter their lives into pieces. I didn't go home that day. I didn't make calls. I didn't cause a scene. I didn't say a word. I simply vanished. I don't recall the first few hours clearly. I only remember my hands shaking, the ache in my chest, and an incessant thought. Why? 40 years. For 40 years I had been there. I had managed the house, the family, their affairs, and now, at the end, they decided to treat me like a convenient fool. For the next 3 months, while they frantically searched for me, contacted acquaintances, and visited relatives, I didn't sit around feeling sorry for myself. I devised a cold, precise plan, one that would leave them with no leverage whatsoever. And if you wish to know how it unfolded and what the outcome was, stay tuned until the end, and please write in the comments from which city you are watching. I'm always curious about how far such stories travel. My name is Sofia Melnikova. I am 65 years old, and for 40 years I believed I had a perfect marriage. How wrong I was. I met Fyodor when I was 25. He seemed like a serious, ambitious, hard-working man who knew how to speak persuasively. He promised me a family, security, a future, and like many women of my generation, I poured my entire being into it. I gave my youth, my strength, and quietly set aside my dreams. I wasn't an impoverished girl with nothing. My father, bless his soul, left me a substantial inheritance, land and properties in a prime Moscow location, plus several plots of land and commercial spaces in the Moscow region, and one large property near Kaluga. It didn't sound as impressive then as it does now, but even then, it was significant. Fyodor began to subtly influence me. "Sofia," he'd say, "women don't understand these matters. It's not an insult, it's just how life is. Let me handle it. It will be better for the family." I was young, trusting, and genuinely believed my husband was my rock. In some purchases and legal matters, I registered us jointly as he requested because it seemed more secure. Then everything accelerated. Construction, tenants, renovations, contracts. And here, I'll be completely honest. He loved to say he was in charge, but more often than not, it was me. I would wake at 5 in the morning, prepare breakfast for Fyodor and Roman, and then head out to the properties. Builders, tenants, finances, disputes. I examined every figure. I knew every incoming and outgoing cent. I collected rent myself, chased down debtors, and resolved issues that were typically considered men's work. In the evenings, I returned home, and my second shift began. Cooking, cleaning, family. As if I hadn't been on my feet and stressed all day. Fyodor preferred to come home late, sometimes at 11 at night, sometimes even later. And occasionally he smelled not of work, but of cheap cologne. I would ask, and he would respond with an air of offense. "You don't understand the pressure I'm under. Be smarter, Sofia. I need support, not an interrogation." We had a son. When I was 28, Roman became my world, my light. I raised him almost single-handedly because Fyodor always had pressing matters. Roman saw how his mother managed the household, and I ensured he had the best: good schools, university, and further studies. All of this was funded by my money, the income I generated from rent and property management. Fyodor enjoyed receiving thanks. He liked to appear as the head of the family, but everything behind the scenes rested on my shoulders. When Roman married Lyudmila 3 years ago, I rejoiced. Honestly, I even thought, here's the daughter I never had. Initially, Lyudmila was affectionate and gentle, hugging me, calling me Sofia Pavlovna, and saying with tear-filled eyes, "You're like a mother to me. My parents abandoned me as a teenager, and with you, I finally feel like I have a real family." I opened my doors and my heart wide. I gave her a position in our administration to assist with documents, tenants, and miscellaneous tasks. I paid her a decent salary, around 100,000 rubles a month by Moscow standards. I taught her everything I knew and even gifted her my mother's pearl necklace. I thought it was a good omen. I welcomed her into the family, believing everything would be fair and humane. Fyodor also seemed to beam beside her. "We found a wonderful girl," he'd say. "Roman, you've done well. It's clear she respects you." Over these 3 years, I noticed oddities, but didn't give them much thought. Fyodor started staying out later. Lyudmila occasionally knew details about the properties that I hadn't shared with her. They would exchange glances, fall silent when I entered. I dismissed it as everyday family conversations, and I didn't want to suspect anything negative. Once I found a receipt from an expensive restaurant in Fyodor's pocket. The amount was around 14,000 rubles for a dinner for 2. I asked him calmly, "What's this?" He didn't even blink. "An important client, Sofia. Don't make a fuss." Then Lyudmila announced her pregnancy, and Fyodor became so emotional he even cried. "I'll finally be a grandfather," he shouted throughout the house. Roman was as happy as a boy, and I knitted. bought little things, and pondered what to put in which box, thinking, "At last, I've waited for this. Now I understand everything." Those glances, those conversations that abruptly stopped, Fyodor's business trips that strangely coincided with Lyudmila's disappearances precisely when Roman was busy or away. For 40 years, I had been the ideal wife, cooking, cleaning, enduring, working, managing, building, holding the family business together like a horse pulling a cart without questions. I sacrificed myself for their convenience, and it turns out they saw me as an old woman they could easily deceive. But there was something Fyodor and Lyudmila never knew, and it was this very thing that would completely dismantle their plan. The months following the pregnancy announcement felt like living in a play where everyone knew their roles except me. Fyodor's changes were subtle, not abrupt, but gradual, so much so that at first I couldn't pinpoint anything. Before, he at least pretended to listen when I talked about tenants, renovations, or finances. Now he'd interrupt mid-sentence. "Sophia, I'm tired. Stop cluttering my head." "You're experienced. You'll figure it out yourself," he'd say, as if I were inconveniencing him. One time in March, I was in my office reviewing figures when I heard laughter from the living room. It was light and genuine. I hadn't heard such laughter from Fyodor in a long time. I quietly slipped out and saw him and Lyudmila sitting very close on the sofa. She was holding a phone, and they were both looking at the screen, laughing like teenagers. Fyodor was smiling in a way he hadn't smiled at me in years. I stepped closer, and Lyudmila quickly hid the phone in her hand. "Oh, Sofia Pavlovna," she stammered. "We were just watching videos about babies. I'm so worried, so happy, you understand." I would have believed her if I hadn't glimpsed, just before, not baby videos, but a chat in a messenger, and there were no baby pictures, only red hearts. Then came the expenditures. Strange, unexplained ones. Fyodor had haggled over an extra 1,000 rubles his whole life, but suddenly he had expenses he didn't even try to properly conceal. One evening, I opened a bank statement and asked, as usual, calmly, without shouting, "Fedya, what is this 60,000 ruble withdrawal at the jewelry store?" He didn't even lift his eyes from the newspaper. "I bought Lyudmila earrings. She's pregnant. She wants to feel beautiful. What are you starting now?" 60,000 rubles. She wanted to feel beautiful, like a queen. He hadn't even brought me a flower for our last anniversary, but I swallowed that too, thinking, well, let the future grandfather be happy. Most unsettling, however, were their hushed conversations. One day, I returned earlier than usual from Kaluga, where I had gone to check on a property. The house was unusually quiet. I went upstairs and found Fyodor in his study. He was standing by the window, holding his phone to his ear, speaking in a near whisper. "Don't worry, my dear, she suspects nothing. Just a little longer, and when the baby is born, everything will be settled." I froze at the doorway. He saw me and immediately hung up. "Who are you talking to?" I asked, trying to keep my voice even. "Roman," he said without hesitation. "For work." I didn't immediately grasp what he'd blurted out, but then it clicked. "Roman," I repeated. "Fedya, Roman is in Yekaterinburg. He's not returning until tomorrow." Fyodor blushed, as if he'd been scalded. "Oh, right," he mumbled. "I got mixed up. It was the accountant." The accountant, of course. Lyudmila also began to change. In the early weeks of her pregnancy, she was constantly by my side. "Sofia Pavlovna, what do you think? What's best?" Then it was as if a switch flipped. She became colder, distant. One day, while I was preparing her favorite meal, she said, "Sofia Pavlovna, please don't be offended, but you sometimes get too involved. I'd like a little more space." I stood by the stove, spoon in hand, and struggled to find a response. Space from me, from the woman who had welcomed her into her home and called her almost a daughter. Then I started noticing other things. Lyudmila knew details about the properties that I hadn't told her. One day, she casually remarked, "Oh, Sofia Pavlovna. By the way, the tenant at Ostojenka is going to be late with the rent again." I turned to her. "How do you know that?" "He called me this morning. I spoke with him personally." She waved her hand, smiling as if I were being difficult. "I don't remember. Pregnancy. My head's spinning. I get things confused." But I knew. I had taken that call in my bedroom. The door was closed. Fyodor began staying out almost every night. Contracts, meetings, investors, and that persistent scent, not of cigarettes or the street, but of someone else's perfume. One night he came home, and I could no longer hold back. "Fedya," I said firmly, "explain to me what is happening. You come home late. Money disappears for unknown reasons. You speak to me as if I'm a stranger here." He looked at me with such coldness that everything inside me ached. "Sofia," he said with disdain, "you've simply become paranoid. These are the fantasies of an old, bored woman." An old, bored woman. After 40 years of marriage, after everything I had done for this home. But what finally broke me was what happened at the prenatal celebration. I had organized a lovely evening for Lyudmila in the garden, invited relatives, friends, made everything beautiful so she would feel important and loved, so she would have positive memories. And then, in the midst of the celebration, I noticed Fyodor and Lyudmila had quietly slipped away. I went to the kitchen, thinking perhaps she felt unwell, needed water. I entered and froze. They were standing inches apart, not beside each other, not a familial embrace. He held her as one holds a woman one loves, whispering directly into her ear, "Soon, my dear, very soon. When our son is born, everything will change. We won't have to pretend anymore. Our son." I felt as if I had gone deaf for a second. Then I heard the blood rushing in my ears. They sprang apart, seeing me. Lyudmila's eyes were filled with tears, not of fear or shame, but of a sweet anticipation. "Sofia Pavlovna," she said in a thin voice. I was so touched. Fyodor Nikolaevich was comforting me. I nodded like stone, turned, and left. Because if I had spoken then, I wouldn't have been able to stop. I didn't sleep that night. I lay there staring at the ceiling, and everything within me began to form a single, repulsive pattern. I didn't have proof yet, but I felt it. I was being led to a place I didn't want to be. And a few days later, we went for that final ultrasound appointment, where Dr. Karatonov first turned pale, then asked to speak with me privately, and then told me something I would never forget. I left the hospital and didn't go home. I couldn't bear to look at them, couldn't bear to hear their voices and pretend everything was normal. I needed space to avoid breaking. I booked a suite at the Metropole for a week, and for the first few days, I simply sat there, feeling like a stranger, and cried as I hadn't since my father's death. Then the tears stopped, and something else emerged within me, a cold, clear, almost calm resolve. I picked up my phone and dialed Roman. He answered immediately, cheerful with background noise. "Mom, hi, is everything okay? How's Lyudmila? How's the baby?" I closed my eyes and said as evenly as I could, "Roma, you need to come to Moscow urgently, but don't go home. Come to me at the Metropole, and tell no one, not Lyudmila, not your father, not a soul." He fell silent. "Mom, what happened?" I exhaled, knowing there was no turning back. "Roma," I said softly, "this baby is not yours." And from the way his breathing hitched on the other end of the line, I knew another world was about to collapse. Not mine, but his. Roman arrived that same evening. I still remember him walking into the suite, his coat unbuttoned, his eyes wide like someone who had been ripped from his normal life and thrown into a nightmare. "Mom," he breathed, "tell me this is some kind of mistake." I didn't beat around the bush. I sat him at the table, poured him some water because his hands were shaking, and laid out the papers I had managed to get from the hospital. "Roma," I said calmly, as best I could, "look at the numbers. Not the words, the numbers." He scanned the lines, then the next, then looked up at me and lowered his gaze again. "Is this the due date?" he asked hoarsely. "Yes, 8.5 months, but I was in Europe in February." He spoke as if trying to convince himself. "Mom, I was gone for almost the entire month. I called you every day." "That's what I'm telling you," I replied. "You couldn't be the father of this child." He sat like a statue, then abruptly stood, paced the room, and stopped at the window. "Lyudmila," he managed. "She couldn't. She's a good person. She's treated me well." "Roma," I said softly. "I also thought she was like a daughter to me." He turned, and I saw something childlike, helpless in his eyes. "And father?" he asked, almost a whisper. "Mom, are you suggesting—" I didn't want to say it aloud, but since we had reached this point, there was no retreating. "Dr. Kharitonov remembers the date when your father was treated for his back. 9 months ago. It all matches." Roman sank back into the chair and covered his face with his hands. I didn't touch him for a minute. Let him experience this pain in his own way. Then he removed his hands and looked at me as if seeing me for the first time. "Mom, what now?" he asked. They'll crush you. All the property, everything. Father always said everything was registered in both our names." It was then I realized it was time to tell Roman the second part of the truth, the part that had kept me going since I left the hospital. "Listen carefully," I said. "Your father believes he controls everything, but that's not the case." "How so?" He blinked, bewildered. I took a small folder from my suitcase and opened it on the table. "When my father died and I received my inheritance, he told me something that I remembered for the rest of my life. Land and housing are foundations. Never give everything entirely into someone else's hands, even if you love them. Back then, I was young, and I did many things foolishly, but I held on to the essentials." Roman leaned closer, examining the documents, and I continued. "The main properties are mine, not joint, not in both our names, but registered to me. The inheritance, by law, is my personal property, and I made sure it remained that way. Father managed things. Yes, he traveled, commanded, acted like the owner, but the owner is where the surname is, and the surname is mine." Roman gasped. "Wait," he stammered. "So Ostozhenka, the property on Ostozhenka, roughly 60 million, is yours. Kaluga, the complex near Kaluga, about 32 million, mine. Commercial property in the Moscow region, around 28, also mine." He looked at me as if a door he had never noticed had suddenly swung open before him. "Mom, why didn't I know?" "Because you're my son," I replied. "I simply wanted to believe your father had everything under control, and I wanted you to grow up peacefully. I never imagined it would one day become our defense, but as you see, it has." I took out a small metal key and placed it beside the documents. "I brought with me what cannot be lost," I said. "The originals, statements, contracts, all the papers that prove who the owner is." Roman picked up the key, held it for a moment, and placed it back down. "Mom," his voice trembled. "So they wanted you to accept the child, and then persuade me, for the sake of family harmony, to transfer some of it to them." I finished his sentence for him. "Everything beautiful with smiles, and you would stand by not realizing they were digging a pit for you." He pressed his lips together so tightly they turned white. "I'll kill him," he said in a low voice. "No," I stopped him. "You won't do anything rashly. We have another task. We need facts that leave them with no room to maneuver." Roman looked at me. "What facts?" "We already have the due date, documents." "That's not enough," I replied. "They'll twist things, pressure, misrepresent. We need everything, their connection, their meetings, the money, and something else." I took out another, thinner, but neater, folder. 5 years ago, I made my will," I said, clearly stating who would inherit what. "Everything goes to you." But there are conditions, so no one can exploit family sentiment and remove me from this world just for the sake of property. Roman paled. Mom, what conditions? If it turns out your father betrayed me and engaged in fraud, he forfeits any rights to my property and to living in the house. And you, Roma? I paused, so he would hear the most important part. You are my sole legal heir, and only you. He sat in silence, and in the quiet, the ticking of the clock in the room could be heard. So he exhaled, they were trying to steal what doesn't even belong to father. Precisely, I said. They've truly backed themselves into a corner now. Roman let out a tight, humorless chuckle, born more of frustration than amusement. Mom, you seem different. I've never seen you like this. That's because you've only ever known me as a wife and mother, I replied. But Roman, my mind has been working behind the scenes my entire life, even if I didn't flaunt it. I paused, then added, and I also have funds that your father knows nothing about. I've been saving for years from rent and my smaller ventures. It amounts to around $8 million in cash and in separate accounts. This is our safety net, so we can remain independent and unburdened by their threats. Roman looked up at me, and for the first time that evening, his eyes held a flicker of hope. Mom, then we can handle this, he said softly. We can, I confirmed, but only if we're smart about it. He nodded. What's your plan? I met his gaze and stated what I had already decided. We'll go back home and act as though nothing has happened. Let them get complacent. Let them believe I've swallowed it whole. While they're basking in their false security, we'll meticulously gather evidence, leaving them with only one path: to fall. Roman studied me for a long moment before slowly nodding. Okay, Mom, I can do this. You will, I assured him, because this wasn't just about retribution, it was about preservation. I walked over to the phone, dialed a number, and paused, my finger hovering over the call button. Roman frowned. Who are you calling? I didn't smile, but a sense of calm settled within me, like the stillness before a precise strike. Someone who knows how to uncover the truth, even when it's buried, I said, and he starts tomorrow. From there, our game begins, and the stakes are far too high to lose. I pressed the number, one I'd been given long ago, just in case. I never imagined that just in case would arrive. The phone was answered quickly. Hello, I need a private investigator, I stated, and I need someone who won't judge or lecture. I need facts. We arranged to meet the following day at a small cafe on Pokrovka Street. I arrived early, securing a seat where I could see the entrance, catching myself behaving as I had in my younger days when dealing with tenants seriously. Every detail noted, every fact recorded, trusting no one's word. He appeared precisely on time. A man in his early 50s, composed and collected, without any ostentatious display. He introduced himself as Yuri Romanov, a former detective with 20 years in criminal investigation, now working privately. When I gave him my surname, he became noticeably more attentive. Sofia Pavlovna, he said evenly, I need details, dates, routes, habits, times when you are away from home, when your husband is delayed, where your daughter-in-law frequents. The more precise, the faster the results, I replied. I retrieved a notepad, which I had started in the metro the previous night, and began recounting everything chronologically. The laughter on the sofa in March, the bank statements, the jeweler, the phone call, their retreat to the kitchen, their comments about our son, and, crucially, the timelines confirmed by Dr. Kharitonov. Yuri listened without interruption, occasionally clarifying a detail or asking for a date to be repeated. He then gave a brief nod. In 2 weeks, you will have photographs, itineraries, and corroborating evidence. If there's a financial component, we'll investigate that too, but I must warn you, it may be unpleasant. I met his gaze and answered truthfully, it can't get any more unpleasant than it already is. What I need now is justice. After our meeting, I returned to the hotel and told Roman, From this moment on, we cannot falter. No outbursts, no impulsive actions. We only make our moves when they serve our advantage." Roman nodded silently, the effort of self-control evident on his face, but he held firm. A couple of days later, we returned home. I had already prepared my explanation. We presented it as one would when wanting to close a topic and avoid further questions. "I had a momentary lapse," I stated in a weary voice. "I was overwhelmed by the pregnancy. I needed a few days of quiet." Lyudmila rushed to me, embracing me as if she were the most solicitous person imaginable. "Sofia Pavlovna, I was so worried. Fyodor Nikolaevich and I didn't know what to think." Fyodor stood nearby, his gaze watchful. He was trying to gauge whether I knew everything or not, while I offered a placid smile, as if nothing had happened. "Everything is fine now," I said. "My only wish is to await the arrival of the baby peacefully." But inwardly, my thoughts were far from peaceful. Peaceful indeed. You will live peacefully. One last week of peace. For the first few days, I forced myself to maintain our previous routine. Morning breakfast, business discussions, domestic trifles. It was the hardest part, sitting at the same table, listening to them plot their future, and I, feigning simple exhaustion. Roman became my main accomplice, and that was vital, as Lyudmila trusted him implicitly. She didn't maintain the same careful facade with him as she did with me. One evening, during dinner, Roman casually remarked, "Lyudmila, I was thinking, after the baby is born, we should do a paternity test, just for the paperwork. Mom will have to sort out inheritance matters eventually, to avoid any future complications." Lyudmila paled so noticeably that even I could see it. "Why?" she stammered. "You're the father. Do you doubt it?" "No, I don't doubt it," Roman replied calmly. "It's just for order, the paperwork so no one can question it later." Fyodor flinched as if struck. "There's no need for that," he said quickly. "Why incur unnecessary expenses and foolishness?" I slowly raised my eyes to him and offered a gentle smile, the kind women employ when their inner feelings are entirely different. "Fedya," I said, "if it's for the family's peace of mind and the child's future, is it too much to ask? If everything is honest, what is there to fear?" He swallowed his words. It was clear he wanted to object, but he couldn't. It would appear too suspicious. Almost immediately after this, Fyodor began to subtly steer the conversation toward another topic, one that now registered as an alarm bell. "Sofia," he said one morning, "after the birth, we'll need to reorganize everything. It would be simpler if Roman and Lyudmila could begin taking over some management responsibilities, to have some things legally transferred to them, purely for the future." "Of course," I replied calmly, even refilling his coffee. "Whatever you say." But inwardly, I knew. This was it. The paperwork. So my understanding was correct. Lyudmila also began to approach the subject delicately. We were sorting through baby clothes when she remarked, as casually as if discussing curtains, "Sofia Pavlovna, I think once the baby arrives, Roman and I should live separately. A young couple needs their own space. You and Fyodor Nikolaevich can have your peace and quiet." "This house has 5 bedrooms," I replied without blinking. "There's more than enough room." She shrugged and looked away. "Well, we'd still prefer our own setup." I simply nodded. "We'll consider it," I said. "We'll discuss everything after the birth." Yuri Romanov began delivering results within 2 weeks. We met discreetly, avoiding unwanted attention, at the same cafe, at the same hour. The first time, he placed a folder before me and said, "Sofia Pavlovna, your husband and your daughter-in-law meet regularly, 3 times a week, always following a similar pattern." I opened it and a knot tightened in my stomach, though I had been braced for it. The photographs were clear. Fyodor and Lyudmila entering the Lotoya Hotel, then exiting. In some, he was embracing her. In others, kissing her, leaving no room for doubt. It wasn't an accidental touch or a supportive gesture towards a pregnant woman, but the intimacy shared between lovers. I looked without crying. My tears had dried up earlier, back at the Metropole. This was different. This was cold. Yuri continued, "There's also a financial aspect. For the past few months, your husband has been transferring funds from his business accounts to a separate account. It's set up so both he and she have access. The amounts are small, fragmented so you wouldn't notice." "How much?" I inquired. "As of today, approximately $3,200,000, he replied. "And that's just what we can track through the transactions." My temples throbbed. So it wasn't just infidelity, but theft as well. "Find out every last detail," I instructed. "And where are they spending it? I need to ensure no one can wriggle out of this later." A week later, he provided an update. It detailed everything: a rented apartment in the Moscow region, furniture, appliances, hotels, restaurants, purchases for their new life. They were building their own little paradise with my money while I was in the kitchen, preparing their soup and believing I had a family. Yuri was about to close the folder but paused, retrieving another sheet, crumpled as if it had been discarded without a second thought. "This was found in the trash," he said calmly. "It appears your daughter-in-law wrote this to your husband." I took the paper, unfolded it, and recognized Lyudmila's handwriting, the same script she used to sign documents in the office. The message was simple and terrifying. "Soon we'll be free, when the baby is born and she signs the papers." I was tired of pretending. How naive they were. I finished reading, carefully folded the sheet, and placed it back. "Thank you," I said quietly. "This is what I needed." Yuri looked at me intently. "What will you do next, Sofia Pavlovna?" I met his gaze, feeling, for the first time in a long while, solid ground beneath my feet. "Next, Yuri," I said, "we will give them exactly what they expect: smiles, tranquility, conversations about the family's future." I stood up, adjusted my bag, and added as I was leaving, "And then, one day, we will strip away their masks, and they won't even understand how it happened." I stepped outside, inhaled the crisp air, and suddenly realized with stark clarity the birth was drawing near, and with it, the finale of my game. Back home, Lyudmila greeted me in the hallway with a smile. "Sofia Pavlovna, Fyodor Nikolaevich wishes to discuss some paperwork this evening." I looked at her and smiled back. "Of course," I replied. "Let him. Because I already know, tonight they'll think they're leading me to sign, but in reality, I'll be leading them to the precipice." By evening, Fyodor himself began to tread cautiously, as if tiptoeing around his objective. "Sofia," he said at dinner, "we really should talk about the paperwork, about the future. Everything will change after the birth." I nodded, betraying neither irritation nor fear. "We'll talk," I responded. "Of course, we'll talk." And in that moment, a peculiar sensation washed over me, as if I were no longer living in their home, but merely a temporary resident, here only to see this through. Even their voices registered differently, like background noise. With only weeks left until the birth, I continued to play my part. Mornings were for breakfast, afternoons for business matters related to the properties, and evenings were filled with discussions about the baby, the stroller, the crib. Lyudmila carried herself with an air of importance, like a queen, while Fyodor hovered around her as if he were 20 again. Roman maintained his composure. Occasionally, I'd catch his jaw twitching when Lyudmila affectionately placed her hand on her belly and said in his presence, "Our son will be with us soon." But Roman remained silent, breathing deeply, gripping his fork, and continuing the charade. I, too, remained silent, knowing our strength lay in our endurance. And then the day arrived. Lyudmila gave birth on September 15th, precisely as the doctors had predicted. A healthy, pink, lusty baby boy. On the hospital records, he was Roman's son. In truth, a child of another destined to be the key to my freedom. Fyodor was the first to arrive at the maternity ward, and from the looks of it, never left. He called me every half hour as if trying to convince both me and himself. "Sofia, can you imagine? We're grandparents. He's so beautiful, so ours." I replied steadily, calmly, "Yes, Fedya, it's wonderful." Roman arrived too, standing outside the room, a smile plastered on his face, as if everything were normal, as if this were his happiness. I looked at him and understood. This boy is my son, no matter what. Because not every man could endure such a situation and not break. When Lyudmila was discharged, she was adorned with ribbons, exuding sweet words and feigned tenderness. "Sofia Pavlovna," she said as I took the baby into my arms, "are you truly happy? You've dreamed of a grandchild for so long." I looked at her and smiled with the same smile I'd worn for months. "Of course," I said. "I dreamed of it." And she relaxed. I saw it. Her shoulders visibly dropped, as if to say, "She's fallen for it, now we can push through." Back home, I orchestrated a small family gathering. No fanfare, no shouting, but with witnesses present. I invited a couple of close relatives who typically attended family announcements, and most importantly, I invited Yuri Romanov. Yuri arrived in a sharp suit carrying a briefcase. I introduced him as we had agreed. "This is Yuri Sergeyevich," I announced, "our legal counsel who will assist with documents and property matters to ensure everything is handled correctly." Fyodor visibly brightened at the mention of a lawyer. Lyudmila clutched the baby to her, as if he were her shield. We gathered in the living room. Lyudmila settled on the sofa, Fyodor beside her, too close, too familiar. Roman sat opposite, and Yuri was positioned slightly to the side, unobtrusive but ready to step into the spotlight when needed. I stood for a moment, surveyed everyone, and said, "I have a few important announcements to make. Now that we have a new member of the family, it's the perfect time to consider the future." Fyodor immediately leaned forward. "That's right," he said. "I was just about to." I gently raised my hand, not aggressively, but firmly enough to silence him. "Fedya, let me finish. I've been contemplating this for a long time, and I've now made my decision." Lyudmila smiled, as if she had already received everything. "Sofia Pavlovna, this is so touching," she said. "You always look out for us." "I do," I replied. "That's precisely why I'm speaking." "Yuri Sergeyevich," I turned to him, "could you please explain to everyone present our current property status? You've reviewed the documents." Yuri opened his briefcase, produced a neat folder, and began speaking in a calm, businesslike tone. "Yes, Sofia Pavlovna, I've examined the primary assets. I can confirm that the key real estate properties are registered in your name as the sole owner." Fyodor blinked, not quite grasping it. "Wait, sole owner?" he questioned. "But we own everything together. It's joint." Yuri calmly turned a page. "No, Fyodor Nikolaevich. The property in the center of Moscow is registered to Sofia Pavlovna, the complex near Kaluga as well, the commercial premises in the Moscow region too. The documentation clearly states a single owner." Fyodor's complexion changed so drastically that for a second I feared he might collapse on the spot, but he quickly regained his composure and attempted to assert himself. "This is a mistake. I've managed this for decades." I nodded. "Managed, perhaps, but not owned. Those are two different things, Fedya." Lyudmila stirred. "But your husband and wife," she interjected hastily. "What difference does it make whose name it's in? It's still family property." I looked at her calmly. "Lyuda, you speak with such certainty, as if you fully understand how this works." She bit her lip and focused on the baby. Fyodor abruptly changed the subject, a tactic employed by those who feel cornered. "All right," he said. "If that's the case, it's even more important to finalize everything properly, so it's easier for Roman and Lyudmila, for the child, for our grandson." Precisely, I said. And it's about easier that we're going to talk. I walked over to a side table, picked up the remote, and turned on the television. The screen flickered to life. Everyone looked at me. Yuri Sergeyevich, I said evenly, please display what you brought me, so we're not just discussing this in abstract terms. Fyodor tensed every muscle in his body. Sofia, what are you doing? I didn't answer. I simply nodded to Yuri. He took out his laptop, connected a cable, and pressed a few keys. The first photograph appeared on the screen, and the room became so silent I could hear Lyudmila's sharp intake of breath. The image that flashed on the screen first was the one that finally made everything click into place for me. Fyodor and Lyudmila stood at the entrance of the Lotoya, pressed against each other, and he was kissing her not like a daughter-in-law or a relative, but like a woman he slept with and was counting on. Lyudmila gasped sharply, pulling the baby closer to her chest as if trying to hide behind him. Fyodor leaped up. Sofia, what are you doing? This isn't true. Roman also stood, playing his part perfectly, for which I remain eternally grateful for his restraint. Dad, he said, his voice laced with disbelief, as if he'd been physically struck. What is all this? I calmly raised my hand. Sit down, Fyodor, and watch. Since we're discussing the family's future today, let's be honest. Yuri clicked a key, and the next series of images appeared. Them entering the hotel on different days, them exiting, holding hands, him embracing her waist, her laughing. Not a single frame could be dismissed as coincidental. Fyodor turned ashen, his lips trembling. I can explain later, I interrupted, not with a shout, but with a tone that silenced him. Now it's time for the facts. Yuri navigated to the next file. Now, the financial aspect, he stated evenly. Over the past 8 months, funds have been regularly transferred from operational accounts accessible by Fyodor Nikolaevich to a separate account. Both he and Lyudmila Sergeyevna have access to it. Lyudmila's eyes widened. That's a lie. The amount as of today is 3,200,000 rubles, Yuri continued, as if he hadn't heard her. The transfers were fragmented to avoid detection. Fyodor swallowed. These were investments. I looked at him, unblinking. Investments? I repeated. Let's take a look. Yuri scrolled, and lines appeared on the screen. Rent for an apartment in the Moscow region, furniture, appliances, restaurants, hotels, purchases entirely unrelated to the baby or family needs. I felt a heat rising in my chest, but forced myself to speak evenly. So, you were building a separate life with my money, I said, while I was at the stove, telling everyone what a wonderful family I had. Lyudmila began to sob, not quietly, but in a way designed to elicit sympathy. Sofia Pavlovna, I'll explain everything now. You don't understand. I turned to her sharply. Don't call me that. You are nothing to me. The room fell silent. Even the baby, as if on cue, stopped crying and merely whimpered. I took the crumpled sheet Yuri had shown me in the cafe from the folder. I unfolded it slowly, making sure everyone could see. Lyudmila, is this your handwriting? She flinched, her face flushing. I don't know what this is. You do, I said, and read aloud, without hysterics, but with each word landing like a stone. It spoke of freedom, of when their son would be born, of signing the papers, of being tired of pretending to love him. Roman stepped forward. Our son. His voice broke. So, the child is from my father? Lyudmila choked back a sob and turned away. Fyodor suddenly straightened, as if preparing to confront a bank. Yes, he blurted out. Yes, it's my child. So what? I'm a living person. I needed a woman, not constant scrutiny and coldness. I was surprised by how calmly I managed to reply. A woman, you say? And what was I for 40 years? Fyodor? He waved his hand dismissively, no longer holding back. You're old now, Sofia. You understand that yourself." He said it as if it were justification for everything. I nodded slowly. "All right," I said. "Then listen to what this old woman has done." Yuri produced his final folder. "The documents are prepared here," he stated. "A petition for divorce, a claim for the recovery of stolen funds, and a notice of termination of residency rights in the house, as the owner is Sofia Pavlovna." Fyodor stepped towards me, his eyes blazing. "You wouldn't dare! I'm your husband. I have rights." Yuri calmly raised his gaze. "Your rights as a husband were nullified by your own actions. The house belongs to Sofia Pavlovna. You have no grounds to claim support from her. And regarding the transfer of funds, if Sofia Pavlovna decides, we can proceed further, even to a fraud complaint." I looked at Fyodor and spoke, no longer as a wife, but as someone who had drawn a line. "You have 48 hours to pack your belongings and leave my house." He opened his mouth, but found no words to retort. I shifted my gaze to Lyudmila. "And you have 24 hours, and you both have a week to return 3,200,000 rubles, with interest, everything you have siphoned from the family funds." Lyudmila sprang up with the baby in her arms. "We can't leave. We have nowhere to go." "The apartment," she said. "It was temporary." I shrugged. "That's no longer my concern. You're adults. You planned everything so cleverly. Now live by your own plan." Fyodor spat through gritted teeth. "If you do this, you'll be alone." I moved closer, close enough that he took half a step back. "Fyodor," I said quietly, "I've been alone for 40 years. I just pretended to have a husband beside me." Roman came to my side and embraced me. "Mom, I'm with you." I nodded, not looking at Fyodor. "I know, son." They left that same evening. Fyodor darted from room to room, grabbing suitcases, muttering to himself. Lyudmila cried, clutching the baby as if he could undo their actions. I went up to my room and watched from the window as they departed with their luggage, their shoulders slumped, stumbling, devoid of pride and any sparkle in their eyes. As the door clicked shut behind them, the house fell silent. It was so quiet I could hear my own breathing. I placed my hand on the windowsill and whispered to myself, "You have no idea this is only the beginning for you." The initial days after their departure were peculiar. The house felt the same, the furniture untouched, the cups on the kitchen counter precisely where they had always been. Yet it was as if the walls, for the first time in years, no longer pressed in on me. Fyodor's nighttime footsteps were absent, as were his disgruntled pronouncements of, "You're late again." That suffocating silence at the dinner table, where everyone pretended to be a family, had vanished. What remained was a different kind of quiet, a peaceful one. I caught myself realizing that for the first time in many years, I woke up without a knot in my chest. Roman stayed close by my side. He slept at home, assisted with various matters, and accompanied me to meetings, as both of us needed to lean on each other until everything was truly settled. He filed for divorce immediately, stating, "No hysterics, no, let's try again." The paperwork was accompanied by evidence, including the very correspondence and bank statements that Yuri Romanov had so meticulously gathered, leaving no room for argument. Lyudmila attempted to maneuver her way out of it. She would call Roman in the middle of the night, weeping, or send lengthy messages about her mistakes and confusion, blaming Fyodor Nikolaevich for pressuring her. Roman showed me these messages, and I could only shake my head. "Mom," he asked one day, "how did they even think they could pull this off?" "Very simply, son," I replied. They counted on me being scared, ashamed, on me saying, "Fine, as long as we don't lose face." They expected me to sign anything just to maintain the illusion of a family. That's what they banked on. Roman remained silent, his jaw tight, then quietly said, "I feel like an idiot." I sighed. "You're not an idiot. You simply loved. And when you love, you don't look for faults in someone. You believe." The hardest part wasn't expelling Fyodor from the house. The hardest part was drawing a definitive line where for 40 years I had only placed commas. At one point I thought, well, he's like this, but at least we have a family. Then, so what if it's late? At least the money comes in. Later, let him shout as long as he doesn't drink. This went on for years, and now it's over. No more. No more making excuses. Let there be truth and consequences. 2 weeks after the night they left, Yuri delivered another report. We met in the morning, quietly, away from prying eyes. "Sofia Pavlovna," he said, "they haven't just moved out. They're trying to twist the situation as if you kicked them out for nothing. They're already telling acquaintances that you made it all up, that you're not well." I let out a wry smile. Of course, they couldn't resist resorting to such tactics. "And what about the finances?" Yuri flipped through the folder. "They don't want to return anything. They claim it was family expenses. But we have everything itemized. Where it went, when it went, what it was spent on. In effect, it's misappropriation." "Excellent," I said. "Then we proceed." I gave them precisely the time I promised. A week, then a couple more days, because after all, I am human, not a machine. But when it became clear they were hoping to outlast the situation, I told Yuri, "We file." And we did. For recovery, for interest, for an injunction to freeze assets where possible, to prevent them from disappearing with the spoils. Fyodor immediately erupted into hysterics. He started calling from different numbers because I had blocked him. He tried to exert pressure, alternating between threats and appeals to pity. "Sofia," he rasped, "do you understand what you're doing? You'll destroy everything." "Fedya," I replied calmly, "you destroyed it. I'm just clearing away the shards so I don't get cut." He would suddenly start yelling, "What are you trying to be? You're nothing without me." And then, the next day, he might be whispering, "Sofia, we've been together for 40 years. Let's handle this like civilized people." After he had called me old and built a new life on my money, Roman held himself together, but I could see the turmoil churning within him. One day, he said, "Mom, if he wasn't my father—" I placed my hand on his. "He is your father, son, but that doesn't mean you have to let him break you. You have a right to boundaries." Simultaneously, I began pursuing what I should have done long ago, my own venture, but without Fyodor. The money that had previously vanished without a trace stopped disappearing. The income became clean. For the first time, I saw the figures as they truly should be, unmarred by someone else's greed. And it became clear to me, all this time I wasn't just carrying the burden of possessions, but also the weight of others' caprices. Roman and I officially formalized his partnership in the management. No more Dad said or Dad decided. I structured everything so that decisions were made by us, and only by us. To my surprise, Roman blossomed. He had always been intelligent, but next to his father, he seemed to live in his shadow. Now he had room to breathe. "Mom," he said one evening as we reviewed the rental reports, "for the first time, I feel like I'm not a son to my father, but a grown man." I smiled. "Late, but timely," I replied. "Everything arrives when it's ready." Yuri kept me informed about Fyodor and Lyudmila's situation, and honestly, I felt no pity for them. Not because I'm cruel, but because I had exhausted my reserves of pity over those 40 years. Initially, they rented an apartment in Krasnogorsk. As planned, but without my money, their affluent lifestyle quickly deflated. Within a couple of months, payment delays began, followed by arguments and shouting. Yuri reported, "The neighbors are complaining. There's shouting every night." He yells at her that everything fell apart because of the child. She yells at him that he promised her luxury. At one point, I even found it amusing because when there were hotels and restaurants, they seemed to believe it was love. But as soon as it came down to ordinary bills and everyday life, it became apparent that their bond was based on money, not feelings. But the most unpleasant developments came later. One morning, Yuri called me earlier than usual. "Sofia Pavlovna," he said without preamble, "we have a new problem." My insides immediately tensed. "What is it?" "Fyodor Nikolaevich is trying a different approach. He's gathering documents to claim that you're not of sound mind, that you have age-related issues, and that you require guardianship. He wants to use this to get his hands on the property again." I remained silent for a second. Then, very calmly, I asked, "Is he serious?" "More than serious," Yuri replied. "And the most dangerous part is, he's already found a doctor willing to sign whatever is necessary. If we don't strike first, he'll attempt to make you legally incompetent." Roman, who was sitting nearby and heard my voice, immediately stood up. "Mom, what's wrong?" I covered the phone with my hand and said quietly, so as not to let my emotions spill over, "Your father has decided to take the dirtiest path. He wants to have me declared incapacitated." Roman turned pale. "He wouldn't dare." I looked at my son and replied evenly, "He already has dared. And now, it's not just about divorce and money, it's war." When Yuri mentioned guardianship and incapacity, I felt no panic or hysteria. It was a different sensation, as if a final veil had been lifted from my eyes. So this is it, I thought. This is what it's come to. Not just infidelity, not just theft, but an attempt to turn me into living furniture so they could quietly take the keys to my life. Roman paced the room like a caged animal. "Mom, I'll go to him. I'll confront him." "You're not going anywhere now," I said calmly. "That's exactly what he's waiting for you to lose control, so we look like the unstable ones. We will act like people following the law." Yuri arrived at our home that same day. Without unnecessary words, he laid out a list of steps on the table. "First," he said, "we take the initiative. We file a motion for protective measures to prevent him from manipulating documents. Second, you will undergo an independent examination, not for him, but for the court. Let there be a report stating you are of full mental capacity and sound mind. Third, we strengthen the defense regarding property matters, place restrictions on any actions without your personal involvement, grant power of attorney to only one person, and absolutely no independent actions." I listened and nodded. There was no humiliation in going to a doctor. The humiliation would have been hiding and pretending nothing was happening. 2 days later, I was in the office of an independent specialist, not a friend of Fyodor's, not an acquaintance of an acquaintance, but someone recommended by lawyers. Everything was official, calm, without unnecessary conversation, but you understand. They tested my memory, attention, orientation, everything necessary. I left with a document stating in black and white, "Competent critical faculties intact, intellect normal." I brought it to Yuri and placed it on the table. "Here," I said, "let him try to say I'm not in my right mind now." Yuri smiled, truly smiled for the first time in a long time. "Excellent, Sofia Pavlovna. Now we're one step ahead." What followed was what I call the tedious, everyday work. Paperwork, applications, notifications, documenting threats and calls, confirming transfers, preparing lawsuits. Not a movie, not grand pronouncements, just step by step, ensuring Fyodor had no leverage left. He still tried. A week later, a letter arrived. He had filed a complaint claiming I had abandoned the family, prevented contact, and had age-related issues. It was all neatly presented, with a hint that an investigation was warranted. I read it, carefully folded it, and told Roman, "See, he's not stopping. He doesn't want a family. He wants control." Roman simply nodded. He no longer argued or defended his father. Something in him had finally broken, and it was painful, but honest. It was simpler with Lyudmila. She played the victim until she realized the money was gone. First she wrote to Roman, then tried to reach me through mutual acquaintances, through distant relatives, through... Well, she's young, she doesn't understand. I discussed it with no one. I had completely stopped making excuses because when you make excuses, it's as if you accept their rules of the game. And I had already chosen my own rules. They thought the money situation would somehow resolve itself. It didn't. The court was not a theater. No one applauded, sympathized, or made grand pronouncements. They simply examined the documents. And our documents were such that there was no point in arguing. For the recovery of the transferred funds, they were ordered to return the sum with interest in installments. No miracles. Not everything at once and beautifully, but real life. Deductions, a schedule, restrictions. Fyodor raged, tried to delay, to wriggle out, but every attempt was met with bank statements and photographs. We quickly thwarted his attempt at having me declared incapacitated. As soon as his lawyer understood that we already had a report and were prepared to file counterclaims for defamation and harassment, the issue rapidly lost its relevance. In plain terms, he understood he could get himself into significant trouble. Fyodor ultimately ended up with nothing, not in a romantic sense, but in the most ordinary, practical way. He used to live like someone who could do anything. Now he lived like someone who had to count his pennies. Yuri occasionally informed me that Fyodor was not doing well. He hadn't found decent work. Reputation in our circles counts for a lot. People might forgive mistakes, but they don't forgive perfidy, especially not like this. He tried to get employment through acquaintances, but everyone knew him. In the end, he survived on temporary jobs, moved into a small apartment, kept up appearances. But inwardly, he must have been seething with hatred. The love affair with Lyudmila ended quickly, not because I willed it, but because when the hotels, restaurants, and other people's money ran out, it turned out they weren't that important to each other. She took the child and left Fyodor for another man who promised to help. Yuri stated this factually, without malice, and I realized I wasn't even curious about who she went to. All that mattered to me was one thing: no longer in my home, and no longer making my decisions. Almost a year passed. I remodeled the house to my liking, not as Fyodor liked, not as was customary, but as was convenient for me. I threw out the heavy curtains that had always felt alien. I created a bright kitchen and planted simple flowers in the garden, flowers I had loved since childhood. And for the first time in years, I felt I had a life, not just a facade. Roman and I officially finalized our partnership in management. He turned out to be stronger than I thought. He was hurt, yes, but he didn't hide. He didn't drown himself in alcohol, didn't lash out with his fists, didn't run to relatives to prove a point. He simply stood by my side and did what needed to be done. One evening, we were sitting on the terrace drinking tea, and Roman said, "Mom, I used to think you were just holding on, but it turns out you were always the strongest of us all." I looked at him and replied honestly, "Son, I'm not the strongest. I was simply tired of living someone else's life." There was no romance in my life after the divorce, and I wasn't looking for it. I didn't want to prove I was still capable. I didn't want to find salvation in new arms. I'm 65. I no longer need someone to call me beautiful to feel valued. I need people around me who don't lie. Roman, after some time, met a woman named Karina. She's normal, calm, from an ordinary family, without pretensions or the calculating gaze of, "What will we get out of this?" When he first brought her to our home, she didn't play the role of the perfect daughter-in-law. She simply greeted me and said, "Sofia Pavlovna, may I help you set the table?" And in that simple phrase, I heard more respect than in 100 sweet pronouncements from Lyudmila. A couple of months later, Karina confessed that she and Roman were thinking about having a child. I didn't burst into tears of joy or jump for excitement. I simply said, "If you decide to, I'm here, but I won't live your life for you. This is your family. I can only offer support." And that, perhaps, is the most important lesson I've learned. Before, I lived as if I were obligated to carry everything myself, as if love meant enduring and closing my eyes. But it turns out that love also includes the ability to say no when you're being broken. Fyodor called me once, after he realized there was no turning back. His voice was broken. "Sophia," he said, "I've realized everything. Let's try to communicate normally, at least." "We have 40 years. I listened, feeling neither anger nor pity, just emptiness. "Calmly, Fedya," I replied. 40 years is not an indulgence. It's simply a duration. You made your choice. Now live with that choice." He started to say something else, but I had already hung up. Not because I'm vengeful, but because I had finally stopped being convenient. And if we're talking about morality, it's not about revenge being sweet. Revenge is a poor motivator, to be honest. It only helped me get back on my feet, and after that, I had to live. The morality lies elsewhere. You cannot surrender your life to people who consider you a mere function. You cannot believe that for the sake of family, you must tolerate humiliation. You cannot close your eyes to what you yourself see. Age doesn't protect you from betrayal. That's true. But age provides something else: clarity. You no longer want to please everyone. You no longer want to live for someone else's approval. You want to live normally, like a human being. I am not alone in a bad way. I am with myself, with a home that belongs to me, with a son who has become an adult, with work that brings in money and a sense that I'm doing everything right. And every night when I go to bed, I no longer catch myself thinking, "Just don't upset him." I simply close my eyes and think, silence. Real, honest silence. And the strongest lesson, I'll put it simply, if you've been betrayed, you don't necessarily have to turn into stone and seek revenge on everyone. It's enough to stop being convenient, and then, strangely, life begins to return to its rightful place.